I'm going to be talking today about paganism in Frisia. Now, if any of you, and I think most of you have been in a class with me, you will no doubt have heard me go on about this, so no introduction necessary on that front, I suppose. But for those of you who have been saved from that, then I will introduce Frisia as it is introduced in the Lex Frisianum, a law code that we will come back to. The area of Frisia is between the rivers of Zvin and Weser, so between part of Belgium. I know we have one Belgian in the room, and we had a Dutchman somewhere floating around too, going right the way through the Netherlands into what is today Germany. We also have North Frisia, which is an area of islands, as well as the coastline around the border of Denmark and Germany today. Most of the evidence I'll be talking about, however, will be this coastal strip. So Frisia isn't contiguous with the modern day Netherlands. It is largely the coastal area that we will be talking about. What's also especially important is that there is a thick belt of peat. Imagine like Irish bogland. That's one of the best places where we still have peat. It's incredibly hard to traverse. And so it meant that for the Frisians of the early Middle Ages, it was easier to communicate along the rivers, along the sea, with one another, as well as across to England and up to Scandinavia, than it was with the rest of continental Europe. So that's something to bear in mind. To get a sense of what life was like back then, we have a very interesting source from Pliny, who describes people around the 1st century AD. And he says, in the far north, the wide coastline is twice daily covered by the ocean's waves. So one must ask whether it belongs to the land or the sea. A pitifully poor people live on little hills piled up just high enough to avoid drowning in the floodwater. On these hills, they build their houses. And when the waves cover the surrounding land, they look just like sailors aboard their ships. When the water level drops, they sooner look like victims of shipwreck. Around their huts, they try to catch fish, which try to escape at low tide. So, glowing reviews on TripAdvisor for early medieval Frisia. Now, these little hills that he is describing are called terpen. We find them all through the modern provinces of Friesland and Groningen, as well as several other places, and they are great to dig into for archaeology. Now, I'm guessing most of you aren't too familiar with early medieval Frisian history, so I'll do a quick blitz tour through. We obviously have Pliny writing around the 1st century AD, but the Roman Empire, whose border had been at the Rhine, pulls back around 300 AD. And in the following century, we get a depopulation of the Terpen area. So these little hills are abandoned by the people that lived there in the Roman time. Around a century later, they are repopulated, but based on the ceramic evidence and the material culture that we find, they are repopulated by what we would term Anglo-Saxons, so people coming in from further to the east. There's a first wave from northern Germany. They're the same people that will continue and go up into, as Connor was describing, into Anglo-Saxon England. And a later wave comes in from the area of Jutland, Denmark, and possibly bits of Norway too. In the middle of the 7th century, moving towards the end of the 7th century, we get increased centralization, political centralization, as seen in the metalwork. We get names that start to be recorded by Frankish annals. These are Aardgils and Redbad, so kings of a Frisian kingdom, and they increasingly are in conflict with the Merovingians, who are pushing up from the south at the same time that this Frisian kingdom is centralizing. The center of this Frisian kingdom, unlike the modern province of Friesland, which is still in the Netherlands, was probably in the central Dutch river delta around the Rhine, potentially around Utrecht. With the death of Redbad in 719, the Franks conquer large parts of Frisia, and with the Frankish conquest comes conversion. Redbad, as we will see, had refused conversion for a very long time, but with the Franks, they also start to convert people. What's important to remember about this, however, is that the Frankish conquest of Frisia lasts right up until 805. So starting 719, ends in 805. It's a very long, drawn-out process. Frisia has to be conquered in 3 steps, and the conversion is equally long and drawn out. As we find out, because in 754, the Anglo-Saxon missionary Boniface is martyred. He is killed in Dokkum by the Frisians. So clearly they have not yet been converted at that point, and this is a continuing trend that we will see. In 810, we get the attack of King Guthrith of Denmark on Frisia. This is the start of the Viking Age there, And the Viking Age in Frisia is a particularly interesting topic. We see that church infrastructure, which was still very much in its infancy in Frisia, is severely weakened by Viking attacks. They're burning churches, they're killing priests, they're stealing reliquaries. And the closest archbishopric at Utrecht, the archbishop pulls back further inland because the Vikings are such a big threat. So any conversion attempts that had up until this point been happening in Frisia are severely weakened, and it's possible some people went back to paganism because of the Danes that had arrived there. This seems to have changed by 920 when the Bishop of Utrecht comes back. There is a re-establishment of order in the coastal area, the expansion and solidification of a parish system, so people actually have a church to go to, and we see that many more churches are built. This leads right up until around 1100, when we get the establishment of the first ecclesiastical institutions in the Frisian coastal area, and with them the first writing. Which brings me on to an important point, that before this time, we don't have any writing that's going on in Frisia. So earlier, my good man Connor was complaining about the lack of sources for Anglo-Saxon England, and I wanted to hit him because, well, we have completely nothing from our period. We have nothing being written until 1100, when it's all Latin stuff. And a few centuries later, we start to get writing in the vernacular, so in Old Frisian. So the reason I've taken you through this quick history is because the period that I want to look at today is from around the start of the 6th century, going through to the 7th century, when we have that independent Frisian kingdom, when it hasn't been conquered by the Franks. And of course, after around 719, we get the various Frankish conquests of parts of Frisia and the start of conversion. But even though they've begun the conversion, as I laid out, it is not done at that point yet. They are still very much pagans in Frisia, and so we might think of a period of syncretism when we have both religions at the same time in Frisia, the conversion not yet complete. The line between the two religions isn't always clear either, which is very interesting. So let's take a look at the sources that I'll be looking at for pre-Christian religion in Frisia up until this point. So we have a few runic inscriptions. There are around 20. That's why you might refer to the Anglo-Saxon Futhark as the Anglo-Frisian Futhark as well, which I of course always do. But these inscriptions are unfortunately very short. They're mostly quite cryptic. Some of them say comb, others are names like this, or that a guy called Fozo carved it. Not particularly helpful when you're trying to find things out about religion. We do have some contemporary texts that we can rely on. Actually, I can use the clicker, that might be helpful. So these are pretty much all hagiographies. These are lives of saints. Of course, the saints come front and center. A lot of them are Anglo-Saxon saints that have come over to try and convert the Frisians. These are very interesting texts, but they are also rather colored, of course, from their background, as we will get into. We also have a legal text from the period called the Lex Frisionem. This is a very interesting text. It's one of the Leges Barbarorum. These were texts that were compiled by the Franks after they had conquered various Germanic kingdoms. So there's one, for example, for the Saxons, there's one for the Thuringians. These essentially acted as a kind of guide to the new Frankish rulers of a Germanic area. What were the native laws of that place that they had conquered? Now, they of course went and changed the laws to newer Frankish laws, but it was important for them to understand the legal culture so that they could do this in an intelligent way. Now, the Lex Frisionem probably dates back to around 800, and it still has, very interestingly for us, remnants of pre-Christian laws. So we have some kind of idea about the legal structure that was in place in Frisia beforehand. Now, the first Old Frisian fragments that we get are from around 1200, so a long time after this period. But what's interesting about those fragments is there are still some hidden references to pre-Christian belief. These are particularly in such texts as Assegerecht, in the compensations for injuries, and Charlemagne and Redbad, which we will focus on later on. We can look at some place name evidence, personal names. Do they have names of divinities in them or other spiritual elements? We can look at toponymy that still exists in the Low Countries and place names that are mentioned in the texts. We can also draw our attention to archaeological evidence, seeing if, like at places in Yevering in England, whether we also have temples whether we can find objects that seem to be of a religious or a cultic nature, and from that infer any inferences about what was believed, and anything that may have been sacrificed or offered to the gods or various other beings. We can take a comparative approach. Of course, Connor gave an excellent presentation on Anglo-Saxon England. We can look across to Scandinavia too, so ideas of sacred kingship might be very important when looking at those kings like Ardgils and Redbad. And we also have the wonderful Icelandic corpus of texts, which is incredibly rich and varied, which we can look across to and see, does this match what we're finding in Frisia as well? Unfortunately for us, the detailed conversion accounts, the wonderful sagas that are incredibly rich in detail, the poetry of Eddic and skaldic nature from Scandinavia, and the great corpus of mythology that has been preserved, we have none of that in Frisia. So that's a great shame. It's wonderful that it exists in Iceland. The approach to looking at pre-Christian religion in Frisia is somewhat different because of that. Because we don't have these kinds of sources, we're forced to use what we have. So Elrond has a bit of a point there. All right, first of all, I'd like to take a look at sacred places, as this is something which is touched on a lot in those hagiographies, those sources of the conversion of Frisia. So here we read in the Vita Liudgeri about the various shrines. Now, the word that's used for a shrine is the Latin fana for the plural, fanum for the singular. You may know the English word fane, which is a borrowing from that. The direct meaning of fanum is somewhat unclear. It's some kind of temple, some kind of shrine or holy place. The texts also mention that within these temples one might find idols or some kind of statues, is how that's normally interpreted. This is very interesting because if we take a look at the Lex Frisionum, so the law of the Frisians, we can read what happens to someone who breaks into a shrine. And it says, "Whoever shall have broken into a shrine and have taken something from what is sacred there, he should be led to the sea, and in the sand which the tide of the sea is going to cover his ears will be cut, and he shall be castrated and sacrificed to the gods whose temples he has violated." So, not too pleasant. What's very interesting is that the martyrdom of Boniface, which occurred in Frisia in 754, that occurs after Boniface is described as having cut down Thunor's oak. So the sacred oak, we can think of a grave, that was near to the border of Frisia. So Hans Moll has actually argued that the killing of Boniface isn't a random act by brigands, as it's portrayed in several of the saints' lives. Instead, this is Frisians actually carrying out the word of the law in the Lex Frisionum, because Boniface has destroyed a sacred place, one of these fanum, and therefore he is being killed. Another of the saints' lives, the Vita Willibrordi, about the Anglo-Saxon Willibrord, who is often called the apostle of the Frisians, mentions a place called Fossituslands. Now, in this text, as well as the Vita Liudgeri, both of which talk about it, we can read what actually happens at one of these sacred places. It says, "None of the natives would venture to meddle with any of the cattle that fed there, nor with anything else, nor dare they draw water from the spring that bubbled up there, except in complete silence." This is quite interesting because it's actually a description of one of these places that is referred to as one of the Fana. However, I'm quite skeptical about this source for a few different reasons. If we read further, we get very much the idea that this is a narrative tale. This is a holy man who is by a storm washed up on a beach. The locals are all a bit weird, and there's a spring there with strange rules. Of course, he will break because he's the rebel. He's being shown as kind of the badass of the story. It's a little bit like the kind of the folk horror tradition. Is very much within that narrative framework. Obviously, it's much later, but the Wicker Man or the Apostle, it's that kind of thing. There may also be, as Tom mentioned, the classical topoi are very important to look for in this case, because it's quite similar to descriptions of the cattle of Helios, which is mentioned in the Odyssey, where there are sacred cows and silence has to be observed, etc. We should remember that the authors of these sources were learned men. They were oftentimes in scriptoria, where they had access to classical texts, and they were writing for an audience that was also very much part of a learned elite, a learned world. So in a way, this wasn't a kind of anthropological exercise to try and show, okay, this is what they believe, this is how the sacred place works. It's rather a narrative, a story that fits into a broader narrative of saints' lives and hagiographies that they no doubt had access to within these scriptoria. It might be a little bit like that we're less likely to refer to, let's say, folklore and folk tales from our own tradition than we might be to a TikTok reel from the United States. And sorry to the Americans, but for me, it's, you know, coming from the United States, because that is the culture of the day. That is what is seen as the, that is what is seen as the culture of the day, rather than necessarily accurately portraying our own lives. Perhaps it's a similar thing, or it's a poor metaphor. Either way. So this Forsitusland is described as being on the border of the Frisian land and the King of Danes. And so a good candidate for Forsitusland is this island in the middle of the sea here. Today it belongs to Germany, and that is Heligoland. Now this would be very interesting because that name would potentially have an etymology of Holy Land, which would indicate that perhaps there is a shrine there. However, there are several other ideas behind the etymology. So in the native Frisian that is spoken there, Hollander Frisian, it's called Deat Loon, which just means the land. But that ethnonym of Hollander actually probably comes from the word Hollig, which I know we have one Frisian who may know at the back there, but that means high land. So potentially Heligoland comes from high land rather than from holy land. It's also true that Heligoland is really quite small. It's actually smaller than it used to be because the British tried to blow it up in the Second World War, unsuccessfully, thankfully, for the people of Heligoland. But there have been quite in-depth investigation archaeologically to look for any trace of a kind of temple or structure, and they found nothing. So perhaps that means we should err on the side of caution with this tale. What is interesting, however, is that name of Forsite, because that name of Forsite is very similar to the name of a Norse god called Forseti, who we find. And it's related to, many people here have been in Iceland, the president of Iceland is called, if I'm not mistaken, the Forseti. And it's related also to the Frisian word Forseter and the Dutch Voorzitter, which also has a meaning of president, which is rather interesting. We find this name of Forseti in Skaldskaparmál, for example. This is Caroline Larrington, her translation of it there, where he is mentioned in a list of various deities and that he rules at a hall called Glitnir, which is rather interesting. And it seems to be the case, based on the etymology of Forsite, that Forsite was the original name and that the Norse likely took the name and then it became Forseti, going over into that tradition. We find another sort of these shrines on another island, this time the island of Walcheren, today at the very other end of Frisia, in the modern province of Zeeland in the Netherlands. And in this story we have Saint Willibrord, who comes onto the island, he destroys a pagan idol, and then a healing well bubbles up out of the ground, and it's said to have healing powers until this day. Now this is rather interesting because we know that wells have a certain significance in pre-Christian Germanic beliefs. There are several sacred wells, in fact, like the Well of Urth, for example. These wells are often hidden beneath the ground, they come up and then they give divine knowledge, such as when Odin casts his eye into the well and then gains knowledge from it. So, as was being said in another of these talks, when Connor mentioned Pope Gregory, who had sent out and said, don't destroy the pagan sites, but perhaps make them Christian. I would argue that perhaps the site that Willibrord has destroyed isn't a site at all, but might actually be the well. What if the well is the shrine in this case? And that he has simply destroyed it by converting the well itself into a Christian shrine with relation to Christianity. Wells are an important motif when it comes to conversion narratives because it contrasts pagans who actually worshipped wells and the powers that came out of it with the figure of Christ, who is shown to be the only wellspring of knowledge that there is. So perhaps that is what is going on here, and that we shouldn't be looking for temples at all, but rather more natural features that might have held spiritual significance and been the home of various spirits. We also get several references to sacrifice in these stories. Here we can read from the Vita Wolframi that the most wicked practice devised by the deceit of the devil resided in the aforesaid leader of the heathens, in that he would very often sacrifice as part of the rites of their gods, the appalling rites, not of gods but of demons, the bodies of those condemned to death, condemning some to the attentions of men with swords, hanging others on public gallows, most cruelly squeezing the life out of others with garrots, while some, with devilish instinct, he would also drown in the tides of the sea or the creeks. So this really comes up as just looking for many ways in which you can kill people in a horrible way. The kind of propaganda behind it, or the subjective view that we see here is very evident, I think, coming through the text. But what is interesting is that we have another reference to drowning at the end. So drowning in the tides of the sea or in the creeks. This obviously mirrors what we see in the Lex Frisionum, where drowning is also the punishment of someone who has broken into a shrine and taken something from it. Now, as I said at the start, Frisia is an incredibly waterlogged area. Today in the Low Countries, they have built dikes, and so that stops the water from coming in. This was before there were any dikes, so it was completely open to the sea and the power of the flood. These floods would not only kill people if they didn't make it onto the Terpen on time, but could flood away whole herds of cattle and fields. It was incredibly destructive. However, at the same time, the sea was literally what enabled the Frisians to go out and become the traders that they would become famous for. They traded all over the North Sea and the Baltic and even further afield. So the power of the sea and whatever spirits resided there must have been incredibly important to the Frisians. And so I would argue that possibly in this regard, the giving of bodies to the sea, the sacrifice by drowning, would enter someone into a liminal state between water and land and possibly appease any deity that was ruling over the sea at that point. We had earlier mentioned, I think it was you, Tom, who mentioned the deposits of armies into bogs and such like. It's possible that this could be a connection with that as well. Although, as ever, if you're dumping things in the sea, we're probably not going to find it back. So it's hard to find archaeological evidence for that. A final example that I'd like to look at from the hagiographies is this one, which is based on ancestor worship. Now, this has often been talked about. It's an episode in which the King Redbad, who refuses to become Christian, is seriously considering conversion. He is standing by the baptismal font, and then he has one question and changes his mind and remains a pagan till his dying days. So this episode is much celebrated both by neo-pagans who see this as a strong pagan figure who rejects Christianity outright and sticks with his previous religion, as well as by Frisian nationalists, because this is a kind of Frisian exceptionalism. Frisians are seen as being incredibly, that when they set their mind to something, they're not going to break, they're not going to stop at all, they'll remain themselves and not be influenced. But there are other ways to look at it. So, as we read, he drew his foot back from the font, saying that he was not able to do without the company of his ancestors, who had been princes of the Frisians, and to dwell with a small number of poor individuals in that heavenly kingdom. On the contrary, it was not easy to give assent to these new teachings, and he was instead going to continue with those that he had observed along with the whole Frisian people for a long time. This is a very interesting passage, and there are a few ways that we can look at it. John Hines, for example, takes the view that this is actually the king making a value judgment on behalf of his people. It may be seen in a similar way to King Oswy, the brother of King Oswald, who was decapitated and possibly partially dismembered by a raven. He decided in 664 at the Synod of Whitby to go with the new Roman tradition rather than sticking with the Irish tradition of the church that he had grown up with. It's possible that Redbad, while for an early medieval king, Christianity had some great advantages, it's possible that he foresaw that converting might instead make him a lackey to the Merovingian king, or perhaps that it would inspire revolt or civil war among his people if others did not want to adopt the new religion, and that was why he decided not to. I take a somewhat different view, and I think we should actually see what is Redbad's reason, that is stated here at least, for not converting. And to me, it's not actually really a religious reason. but rather, if I dare say as a Frisian, slightly more snobby reason, which is that he complains that his ancestors had been princes, whereas those in the Christian heaven, which is of course open to any whose souls have been saved, are a small number of poor individuals. So to me, that suggests that the afterlife that Redbad had envisioned was one in which he would be with fellow members of the aristocracy. And I think that's a rather interesting point there, and that at least if we can rely on the Vita Wolframi, which is another question, then that would be his reason that he did not wish to convert and then end up in the Christian heaven. So there's a big question about whether the Vita Wolframi is actually reliable or not. These hagiographies and missionary texts, they have a certain bias. They were written in a milieu that was aware of older saints' lives, of classical texts as well, and they knew that the audience, which was largely also churchmen, we believe, would also be aware of that. And they were writing with that in mind. So Ian Wood has written specifically about the Vita Wolframi, and he believes that really most of it is fabricated, and we shouldn't really believe anything that comes from that text. Others, like Stefan Lebeck, do believe it's actually a reliable text, that much of the information about the pre-Christian Frisian religion comes from a young boy, a Frisian boy who was saved from sacrifice by Wolfram, though the jury is still out on that. It remains the case that these hagiographies, they always focus in on the negative, more barbaric aspects, because they were literally trying to stamp this belief out. So we should definitely bear that in mind when we look at it. We never come across pagans doing anything that is productive or helpful. They are either terror-stricken, as they are on Forsythusland, or they're busy garroting and stabbing and hanging and drowning people. It's not the most flattering picture, and we're sure that they were up to other things too. But, well, we don't have that written down, unfortunately. To move on quickly to one of the old Frisian texts that we have. This is from Van de Koningen Karle aan de Redbad. So this is a very interesting text because the oldest fragments from this are found from around 1200, though the only complete text that we still have is from around 1660, though it definitely goes back to an older tradition. What's interesting about this is that this is a story, so we have Koningen, so the king Karle, which is Charles, so that's Charlemagne, and Redbad, so Redbad, the king that we've just been looking at in the Vita Wolframi. And this is a source that basically talks about how the Frisians were given law by Charlemagne, although of course this is long after the time of Charlemagne and Redbad. When those writing it, the Frisians were also Christianized. The story goes that Charlemagne selected 12 lawmen, aseiran, as they're called in Frisian, and he set them adrift on a rudderless ship out into the sea. So we pick up from there. It says, when they had finished praying, then they saw a 13th man sitting at the tiller, and he had a golden axe upon his shoulder, with which he steered to land against the current and against the wind. When they came to land, then he thrust the axe into the land and threw up a sod. Then a well sprang up there. That is why it is called at the court of axes. That is Axenhoven in the old Frisian there. It's related to Hof in Dutch, for example. And they came to land at Eswe and sat around the well. And whatever the 13th man taught them, they accepted it as law. I'd like to focus in, there are many interesting things going on here, but one thing that is particularly interesting here is this word, which is Eswe. The reason why Eswe is interesting is because we believe that an older form of this word would have been Esawe. And Esawe can be translated as the road of the gods. And if we break that down further, the gods part of that is Esa, which is etymologically related to the Old Norse Aesir. And what's further interesting is if we can compare this with the Old English corpus, we see that in the Old English corpus we do actually get on its own an Esa, which is obviously from the more Proto-Germanic root of ans, which is God, os, I think it is in Old English, and then I believe this is an I mutated form that we find. So in this case, in the genitive, I would believe if it's from Esawe. So this is very interesting because it may suggest that what we're looking at here is a pre-Christian myth that has survived in this story about the law code that has then been given a sort of Christian shell around it. So most of the time, the 13th Aseira that comes and brings the 12 others to land is seen to be Christ. We obviously have the disciples, the same number as 12. That could be interesting. But we could also suggest that 13, the reason why we have an odd number of Aseira, is because in a law decision, you will never have a split decision if there is an odd number of people. So there may be a practical reason why there are 13 there. The other big question that I would ask about this is, why would we have a reference to the road of the gods with a word that comes from Ans in this story unless it went back to something from the pagan past? If it was important that it was a divine road, they could have used any number of words there. God's way, for example. God is a good Christian word that is used for God at this period and no one else. And yet we find Asa way, which is obviously, as I said, related to the Aesir, related to the Old English words for those same gods. Nelleke Eisenacher and several others have, based on this, suggested, and based on several of the other themes, a golden axe, a well springing up from out of the ground when a turf is removed, that this does have the feel of a kind of myth to it, and perhaps a pre-Christian myth that has been preserved. Could we be looking here at a literary version of Pope Gregory's message, that instead of destroying the pagan, you simply Christianize the pagan, and that this is a pagan story that has been Christianized and then encoded in Old Frisian law? It's possible. It's an interesting idea, but further research is, as ever, required. So I'll quickly take a look at a few place names that we have from the Low Countries. Conor also mentioned in his talk about various of these place name features that may relate to temples, shrines, holy places. We have various places in the Netherlands. We have those that are derived from Heer. Oh, I've gone a bit too fast there. We have several that are derived from Heer. We can also look at others derived from such elements as Weoch, or the Old Norse Ve, such as in Vebond, and Odin's Ve, for example. We also have some that may come from Eal. This is also seen on early Bracteates as Allu, that kind of reference to the divine holy places and idols, as well as some that incorporate the word holy, which probably go back to an earlier date. Now, I compiled this map that was based on the excellent work of a list that was compiled by Olivier van Renswoude on his blog taaldacht.nl that just documents quite a few of these various toponyms based on their mythological or their sort of spiritual toponyms that we see there. And we can see that they are all over the place. And obviously many of them we might have lost over time anyway. So yeah, there are many of them that could have been in use. Let's finally, and I'll go a little bit faster because we're a bit behind schedule, but let's take a look at the archaeology. So I had a look at some funerary rites from Frisia to see what information can be gleaned there. For that, I looked at 3 main cemeteries. So the cemetery of Oostgeest, which is in South Holland, very fun one to pronounce. We can all try that at the pub later. There are 2 from Friesland. There is one from Eersterbeintum, Oosterbeintum in Dutch, and Heerebeintum, which is Hoogbeintum in Dutch, and then try to compare what we saw there. So what is it that we see in the funerary rites? So we see that there is both inhumation and cremation burial, and there is no clear pattern to age, gender, and social status. So what I mean there is that we don't see that it is only women that are created and men that are buried, let's say. It is pretty much all through each other. It's very random, quite similar to what we find in Scandinavia around the same time, that there isn't a clear way that someone is to be buried. It's very diverse. What's also varied is the positions in which the deceased are placed, especially if we compare that with the later Christian burials. Some are on their backs, some have their knees crossed, others are in crouched positions, and some are in such weird positions that archaeologists have called them deviant burials. And they may have been criminals in life, they may have been foreigners, is another thing that's been suggested based on some of the DNA evidence that has gone with it. And maybe they were just incredibly quirky individuals. We don't really know, but that's the fun with funerary rites. So We frequently find grave goods that are also alongside. Around half of those that I looked at had grave goods with them, and these are often typified on the basis of the sex of the deceased. So a lot of the time we will find jewelry that is associated with women, with them, fibulae, for example, and brooches like the domburg type, as well as spindle whorls. Of course, spinning was incredibly important, and later Frisian law gives a very high fine to someone who harms a person who is involved in spinning wool, i.e. most of the time a woman. So clearly that was incredibly important, and these were things that followed them into the grave. We have a few examples, though, where the sex of the individual does not line up with the grave good that they are given. And based on some of the comparative approaches by looking at Scandinavia, this transgression of the traditional gender role with what they were given perhaps indicates that they had a religious role in life, thinking especially about save and other such things. But again, it's hard to tell based on the quite scant evidence that we have. It's worth bearing in mind that because of the soil conditions of the Netherlands with frequent flooding, these cemeteries often aren't incredibly well preserved. The Terpen, these hills that were piled up, were incredibly fertile farmland, and in the 19th century the Frisian farmers found out, and they thought, hey, this is brilliant. They started to excavate them, to use them as fertilizer on their own farmland, which was great for them, but they started to pull out all of these old things. So we have a lot of these, they didn't really know what to do with them, so a lot of them have disappeared. A lot of the finds that we know were once there, we don't have anymore, or we don't know what their find contexts were like. So it's often rather difficult to work with the material. One particularly interesting thing for Frisia is that we have horse and dog burials. Now, these are frequently buried alongside humans. The horses were almost always stallions. They were almost always in the primes of their lives. So perhaps we can suggest that these were sacrifices. They weren't old mares or nags, as you might call them, which had sort of dropped off and then they chucked them in the grave. These were probably part of some rite that was part of the dead. But, and for any dog lovers, you'll be pleased to hear, most of the dogs were quite large, and actually going on a bit of a tangent, but a later Old Frisian law code has 5 ranks of dogs, depending on how much weregild you have to pay if you harm such a dog. It ranges from dogs that can kill wolves to dogs that lie around the farm and don't do anything and aren't particularly useful. But anyway, but these dogs, most of them are quite old. So it suggests that these may have been the kind of pets or the animals of the individuals that died, and that when they died, they were also put with their human. So that's quite nice. But what does this tell us about beliefs in the afterlife and potential spiritual beliefs? It's quite hard to say. The dead don't bury themselves. And as Connor mentioned for St. Cuthbert, we're not entirely sure whether we're looking at something that we should call religious, or is this something that is cultural? That this is a cultural tradition and that the horses and dogs that are buried have no religious significance, but rather it's to show the social status of the person who was buried, rather than that they believed that there was some kind of religious symbolism behind it or purpose. However, what I will say is that it's very interesting that we find grave goods alongside them. The kinds of grave goods are also enlightening. And the fact that we find animals buried alongside them, as we find, of course, in the old Frisian law codes, these dogs could be very useful. They could be taken into battle. They could defend livestock against wolves, or they could lie around on the farm being not particularly useful. But it may suggest that these were objects that people were expected to need in a second life that they might have. If we're looking at combs, knives, spindle whorls for spinning, gaming pieces, etc., these are things that suggest that it isn't just a soul that goes on into the next life. It is a body, because why would you have a comb if you don't have hair to comb with? Unless, of course, it is rather not a religious thing, but a social thing. However, I think that seems unlikely, given the effort that was put into a lot of these. So an interesting facet of Frisian burials is that we do have a few ship burials. Unluckily for us, we don't have any huge royal boat burials like at Sutton Hoo and places in Scandinavia. However, we do have some smaller ones. So we know of one from Sollefeld near Den Haag, and we have 2 from East Friesland, you'll be happy to hear. from Dunham and Fulvert. These are more like rowing boats, and they are then covered over with planks, the deceased being placed inside. We also have half a dugout canoe from a burial in Jemgum, which is in West-Friesland, and we have one of the Hegerbeinten burials, which we unfortunately no longer have because it was excavated in 1905, around then. That was also said to have been in a boat-shaped coffin, which is also a rather interesting little allusion. Another piece of evidence for this is that 17 out of the 42 nails from Eersterbeintum were clinches. And clinches are a kind of rivet that is used on a ship to make sure that I believe it's that the hull can actually endure the force of the waves crashing against it. So an essential part of a ship. So why are they burying people in ships here? Well, a lot has been said, obviously, about ship burials in England and in Scandinavia. Some thoughts about the Frisian examples, because none of them are large royal ships with slaves and animals chucked in. They are simply a person in a rather small ship that has been buried. Perhaps it's the case that they need some kind of transportation to get to where they're going next. Or is it because they might be coming back? We know from later Icelandic sources that when it comes to grave mounds, that sometimes people would sit or lie down upon grave mounds and that the dead would communicate with them and give them information they wanted. Is it possible that such boats were meant to be so that the dead may sometimes return and be of use to their community? It's hard to say, but it's an interesting idea. We also have from Oostgeest a very interesting case where we have secondary deposits. So primary deposit is the first time something goes into the ground. Secondary means that it has either been dug up once again and then buried again. We also find similar parallels with the Norse funerary ritual, especially if you read Price, he goes into some detail about that. But what is very interesting is that we also get secondary deposits from Oostgeest that have not actually been buried at all, but they've been excarnated. An excarnation is when you let the body decompose above ground. Now, even more interesting, in my opinion, is that we also have signs of scavenging marks by carnivores and by birds, indicating that these animals, that these bodies have been left to be picked clean by various animals. And the types of wounds that we see on these bones, obviously after they've already died, are peck marks. So probably from crows and other carrion, as well as the bite marks of various carnivores, possibly wolves, foxes, dogs, that sort of thing. And it's possible this is related to the Germanic idea of the beasts of battle, which are described as appearing before a battle. There are many kennings which go into feeding the ravens or the wolves preparing to feast, that kind of thing. So could it be that these animals, the wolves and the ravens, which, as Tom mentioned in his talk, are very much associated with the god Odin, are perhaps part of a specialized funerary rite that is reserved for warriors? Particularly intriguing is that those secondary deposit bones that show signs of excarnation are all from young men. So perhaps it is something that is associated not necessarily with the warrior, but with young men in general. Or perhaps are we seeing evidence of the prior Iron Age rite of excarnation instead? It should be mentioned that so before we have that mass exodus out of the Terpen area following the Roman period, we know of no burials from that time, but we know that there were people there. So is it possible that the reason we don't have any burials from that period is because they aren't burying people, but they're leaving them above ground? We know, for instance, from places like Tibet, Mongolia, various Native American tribes, that certain social groups are also excarnated instead of being buried. So it's an intriguing possibility that we don't know the answer to, but there are several possible options there. I'm going to go really quickly through material culture so that we can get on to Jonathan. A lot of this is based on the excellent work of Johan Nicolai into metalwork and kingship in Frisia. And what we see if we look at some of these brooches from Friesland is that we can make out a face there. And we can actually also make out another face here. And what you can see is if you compare the size of the eyes is that all the time one of the eyes is larger than the other, perhaps giving a one-eyed depiction of this face. Around the eyes we get several beasts. These are mostly horses that we can see. And we get, again, more beast faces on the footplate here on this brooch too. There are several examples of this that come out of the ground. Sometimes these animals look like horses, other times they look like birds or wolves or serpentine creatures that we see. But very frequently we get this idea of a face and then several animal heads around them or animal bodies. The same is true for bracteates, which we also get in large abundance in Frisia. Many of them are based on examples from Scandinavia, others are more similar to those in Anglo-Saxon England, showing their contact there. What's very interesting about these bracteates, however, is that they often show animals, mostly a horse with a face. And while this face was probably originally based on that of a Roman emperor, it has changed somewhat by this period. What's interesting about this example is that you can see there is a man with a pretty funky hairdo, some kind of mullet, I think, riding on a horse. But that if you've ever seen a horse, that is not what horses' hooves look like. But it is how they depict human feet at this point. So we have a human head on top of a horse with human feet. And if you can see there, I'm not sure how clear it is, but you can see that the horse's mouth is open, and on quite a few, the tongue is also lolling out. So how this has been interpreted is that this is an image probably of the god Odin, probably called Woden at that point in Frisia, that is becoming an animal. And that this man between beast motif, as it's described, having that face between various animals, and of course in the metal it all sort of blurs together, might be the case that we're seeing something shamanic, where a man is becoming an animal in various rituals that we see. So Nikolai echoes Olson's study into Odinic symbolism here about migration period metalwork. And he believes that these animals that are depicted are Odin's familiars, and that the reason why the horse's tongue is lolling out, and why we saw in Tom's presentation the two birds that are sort of, they appear to be leaning in. We saw in Petter's presentation on the seat, you can see the female-looking figure. There were also two ravens on the arm rests that are also sort of bent in as if they are speaking to the person. Is it the case that they are getting divine knowledge from these animals, that they are able to communicate with people, just as we read about in the story of the Volsungs, when Sigurd, he eats the heart of Fafnir, and then he is able to understand the language of birds. Very interesting, and these are possibilities that this is what's being shown on the metalwork. These are Domburg brooches, so typically Frisian brooches, probably worn by women. And the point I wanted to make here is, again, we have that symbolism of the two birds that are leaning in. But as time goes on, we stop seeing so clearly the lines of two birds, and they basically just sort of create the basic shape. They don't really care about the birds at that point. Here are some beautiful examples again from the Frisian Terpen area. We have again this idea that there are faces and animals between, but as time goes on, the actual animal becomes less important and it becomes more stylistic with various swirls there. But with this very fancy graphic, I just wanted to show that if we flip it on its head, we can again see some kind of face. Obviously, there we do have something in the eye, there we don't, and with a mustache underneath. So that may be, again, Odinic symbolism. This is interesting. It's found at Elsfleth in Lower Saxony, so quite close to the border with Frisia. This is likely Frankish work, probably depicting Christ. But if we zoom in, we can see that the niello fill of the eye has been carefully removed to make it one-eyed. So here we have literally Christ becoming Odin in this way, to perhaps make it more suitable for people in this area who were pagans at that time. Very interesting piece of metalwork. So to move quickly forward, what are we seeing on the metalwork? Well, I would posit, as others have done as well, that we may split it between various social orders. That for the upper nobility, the royals in Frisia, the mythological significance relating to Woden and possibly to specific myths that were no doubt being told in their halls by their skalds, as we read in Beowulf, that this was very important, that relation to Woden, the god of the lords. The ancestral connection with Scandinavia, as well as the contemporary shared connections, were also incredibly important and were being expressed through the material culture. So we have both the importance of religion and cultural affinity. But for the local elites, the lower nobility that were making these debased domburg brooches, where you can't actually tell what is being depicted, it's just the basic shape, then it's a visual representation of the personal bond between a patron and the king, rather than a religious symbol. So the symbolism on the jewelry isn't important. It's rather the marker of the political affiliation. So this is very interesting because it shows that various elements of the pre-Christian religion may have been important to different people, and perhaps not everyone was allowed in on the secret of the mythology. That perhaps divine knowledge was also kept to a certain group, and that they had a certain afterlife to which they would go, hence that they would have a certain funerary ritual. And that for other classes in the society, so those poor individuals that Redbad didn't want to be with in the afterlife, that something else was due for them. It's possible. Can we know anything about the very lowest classes and what they believed in? Well, possibly by looking at certain magical objects. I was about to say omelets, but that's not what we're looking at here. We have some amulets though, and some charms. We find tooth amulets, especially those of dogs and wolves' teeth, which have been found. And interestingly, they seem to be connected with children a lot of the time. And it's thought that there's a possible connection with trying to ward off sickness in children by giving them a wolf's tooth. We also find discs of red deer antler, which also may have been connected with fertility, as these red deer antler were often hung outside of apothecaries in the later Middle Ages, and from the Roman time we know that they also had a connection with fertility, so maybe this was something that was quite important for women at the time. Speaking of which, we also have a shell from we don't find these shells at all in the Frisian coastal area, so it's probably traded up from the Mediterranean. This was found on a woman's forehead in a grave at Fervert. And we may connect this shell with ethnographic examples from southern Italy. So in Sicily, still in the 19th century, women were wearing amulets with the exact same kinds of shell around their necks. And that was because they thought that it would make them more fertile and protect them in childbirth. We also have a few other examples of these shells being used in similar ways in Northern Europe at the time when the woman of Fervert was alive. So it's possible that that's what's going on here, because the shell itself, when held in a certain way, looks just like a vulva. So perhaps that's what they're trying to emulate by wearing such a thing. We also have a very curious little bronze box that may have contained herbs and appears to have been something that could be worn around the neck, although of course that can have other functions too. So let's race towards the conclusions here. What can we conclude about religion in Frisia at this time? Well, we know from the textual sources of the hagiographies that shrines were very important places. There were special rules that applied here and which were protected by law, in this case by the king, by Redbad, or at least the authority of the land. So place name evidence certainly suggests that there were many of these shrines around. But archaeologically, we don't have any evidence for large temples or lots of sacrifice like the oxen skulls from Iceland and other places. We simply don't have it. So it's possible that whatever rites were being performed there were archaeologically invisible and that we therefore don't have them. It's also very likely, I think at least, that these would be quite minimalist rather than necessarily being grand structures anyway. So we're not sure what to look for in that case, but I think they were likely important central places. The lord or the king played an important role in the religious cult, as he was tasked with the protection of the shrines as the giver of the law, and the law obviously included that shrines had to be protected. And we can assume also that he oversaw the religious ceremonies that occurred at the time. That's certainly the impression we get from the Vita Wolframi, if it can be believed. The symbolism in artwork, the choice of funerary rites, and the understanding of the social position, we can understand that the religious and the secular were tightly bound together, that probably we aren't looking for a separate priest class in this case, but rather members of the secular elite that were the purveyors of this knowledge. From the funerary rites, we get the idea that this is a non-dogmatic approach to death, and I would extend that the religion also had a non-dogmatic approach to life, where there wasn't a sacred text or a kind of something to draw on that had all the answers. rather that it was more diverse. Perhaps we can look at regional differences. Of course, Oostgeest in South Holland is an area where there was more settlement continuation from the Roman period to later. So perhaps they had a different funerary rite with the excarnation. It's possible that's an explanation for that. The inclusion of animals in the graves I find also very interesting, because it says something about their idea of what happens in the afterlife. Although whether we interpret that as being solely religious or as more a marker of social status is just the question. And by looking at the jewellery, we can see how these ideas developed and how possibly different things were important for different people and different social groups at that time. It would suggest by looking at this jewellery that the distinction between human, animal and divine is literally blurring within the metalwork. And I would argue that by including horses and dogs in graves, you're also doing the same when it comes to the funerary rite and the afterlife, which is quite interesting. The idea that one could use teeth of various animals or antlers and shell amulets to give a certain boon to people and to harness some kind of desired power that these animals have may suggest that they also believed in some kind of animism, that there was a soul in various objects that we would class as being inanimate, or otherwise why wear them. But as with many of these things, they raise more questions than we have answers. But I hope I was able to give a few answers to you all today. So thank you very much for listening. All right, are there any questions? Yeah, Eric?
You were talking about the name, like the named city Heliopolis, weren't you?
I mentioned Helios, the capital of Helios, the island, but I don't think I mentioned Heliopolis.
I thought you talked about like a city like Helios, like talking about in holy or on a hill.
So I mentioned the island Heligoland, which is between Frisia and Denmark, and that was called Fossitasland in the text, and that there may be a connection with the story that comes in the Odyssey about the cattle of Helios, which is when Odysseus ends up on a strange island where there are these cattle that can't be slaughtered, and he slaughters them as well and invokes the wrath of the god, but him being Odysseus, he gets away with it. So,
okay.
Yeah,
it was my mistake, because I
No problem.
reading from the English side, there's in the English side, we're traveling like to Eastern Russia, there's a place there called Heliopolis.
okay,
But like there was like a comparison.
yeah. No, in this case, alas, no, but yeah, interesting. Does anyone else have any questions? Yeah, Nathan?
I was curious what kind of resources would have been available to them for building their temples and settlements and other buildings. A lot of trees.
No, that's an excellent question, because there are not many trees at all. So that's one interesting thing with the funerary rite there, is that we find very little wood being used in buildings at the time. It's quite scarce, actually. So the fact that they're building funeral pyres, and one of the counter arguments for why there may be these clinches is because they're reusing wood from ships to burn. But to answer your question, yeah, they don't have an awful lot. I mean, they're not pulling stone out the ground because it's all clay in the coastal area. I mean, they could build houses out of sods. You still normally would need pillars, so you would expect, if they're building temples out of sods, as they built some of their houses out of sods, that we would find those post holes. But so far, we simply haven't found anything. So yeah, it's a good point. So maybe that leans them more towards having an open kind of shrine or an open kind of structure rather than that. But yeah. Any more? Petter?
I'm guessing the importance of water as well, and the sea, the tides, as you described it, where they had perhaps funerary traditions connected to the sea, but also the importance of the wells, and perhaps, like Nathan pointed out, their surroundings would have affected the development of their religion, more oriented in this case towards the sea, and as you put it, towards places.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, all of Frisia at that point was basically an open place. The sea is incredibly important, incredibly powerful, and I think I do wonder in some ways how much does the geography affect the mythology. So in the Old Norse tradition, mountains are quite important. You know, the giants live out in the mountains. Forests are also important because we have a lot of forests and mountains, obviously, in Scandinavia. But it does make one wonder, was there a very large importance on the sea in the Frisian mythology? Of course, we don't have it related, but that one text which I showed, from the Carolingian Karla and the Redbad, I mean, that all happens out on the sea, and it's with an island, and it's with a shipwreck and a rudderless ship. So we know the Anglo-Saxons are said to have come to England on 3 ships. So that's an important piece of memory of where their ancestors came from. So maybe it's something similar in Frisia, indeed, that the open landscape is what is most important, the large horizon that one can see. Of course, the blurring of the land and the sea is something that comes across already with Pliny and various other Roman writers and throughout that period of history. So it's quite possible that would have made it into the religion as well. Yeah, I'm conscious of time. Are there any further questions, or shall I hand over to my good man, keynote speaker, to come? All right, thank you very much.